Good morning, Doug. Today, I want to talk about something that you said at the end of a call we had last week. And what it was is we're just like looking for a little bit of advice to kind of wrap up the call, maybe end on a little more positive note. And you said what it was critical to focus on maintaining a sound mind and a sound body. And because it was in the call, we just wrapped up with that. But there's a lot to this topic. I mean, what do you mean by this? Why is it so important?
Well, you've got to figure what you really are.
Hmm.
So we know we have a body, okay? And if your body won't do things that you need and want it to do, you're not very useful to either yourself or other people. But wait a minute, what's myself? All right, mind. So this is your thinking facility, and it operates your body, and it's got to think logically and rationally. Well, I think it should think logically and rationally. Even dogs and horses and even insects think not deeply perhaps, but pretty logically, and they get by and rationally. And if they're not rational, they die. Okay, so I think this has been recognized for a long time. If people don't, even if people don't think about it, the Romans had a phrase, uh, mens sana in corpore sano. And that means a sound mind and a sound body in Latin. Uh, but, there's something that might be missing because it's often said, people often divide yourself into mind, body, okay, mens sana, corpore sano, fine. They say mind, body, and spirit. Or, you've got to have heart and soul. But what's the difference between heart and soul? And how does that relate to mind, body, and spirit? So, you know, I'm, I'm actually not sure. You got to ask yourself what you are before you even ask yourself who you are, and then what do you do to maintain yourself? So it's actually a really pretty big question. I mean, especially when you get into the potential spiritual part of it, which may or may not exist. I guess
Hmm.
I'm not completely sure it exists.
I'm not. I don't think anyone is completely sure, except for people who don't use their rational mind at all and are just somehow convinced themselves of all kinds of things. I mean, not to say it doesn't exist, but only you could only be certain if you weren't using your rational mind. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus has never talked to me, and neither is Mohammed. Although I don't think Mohammed actually talks to people the way Jesus does. But Muhammad was only a prophet. He wasn't supposed to be God. So I don't know if that's within his bailiwick, his job description, as it were. He did his talking when he was on earth. And where is Muhammad now? He's surrounded by, I forget the exact number, I think 78 virgins? Or does Muhammad get a better kind of heaven because he's the prophet?
Shit.
They don't answer these questions adequately when they go into these discussions of spirit, I'm afraid.
No, they don't, and I don't think we'll answer any questions of spirit adequately here either. But
No, probably not.
what do you think about? So why is? I mean, the thing that jumps out to me when you said this is that regardless of what else is happening in the world, this obviously is something that is within our control. And as a Stoic, I look at that and I go, that's where you should be focusing anyway. I mean, not exclusively, but you should definitely be focusing on things that are in your control as your priority. And this is.
Yeah, yeah, it is. One of the, I think, one of the better parts, and it's time for me to launch a small commercial for Assassin. Those of you who did not buy this book for a Christmas present to your friends denied them some excellent Christmas reading. And I know it sounds incredible that a book with a title called Assassin could be good Christmas reading, but it's good reading anytime. Anyway, enough of the commercial. Go on Amazon and buy it. I promise you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah, and if you don't
And
hate your friends, unless you hate your friends, you should definitely
yeah,
go buy it for them. Get an extra copy.
exactly. And I think this book, in many ways, is a kind of a litmus test,
Mm.
the way Atlas Shrugged often is. If somebody reads Atlas Shrugged and they say, that is a horrible book, it's unrealistic, it's all the terrible things you can say about Rand's books. Well, chances are, if you're listening to this uh, podcast and you like it, you'll like Atlas Shrugged. And if you don't like Atlas Shrugged, you probably won't like the things we're saying here. Probably.
Probably.
So, same thing with Assassin. But here's why I brought it up. Here's why I brought Assassin up. It's that when Charles Knight spends 18 months in the can, various federal prisons, for his exploits he was convicted of as a drug lord. What's he going to do? A lot of the time, Charles was in the hole, solitary. So he had a 6x9 cell, um, and that was his life. Basically, nothing to read. So what do? Well, I guess you can attack it two ways. You can do what Charles does in the book, or you can just sit there and wait for the time to pass and go slowly crazy, which I guess a lot of people are doing during this COVID hysteria too. They're just sitting around locked in their apartments and going nuts, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. It's like with Charles in the book, though, it seemed as though there was a recognition in his head. The only way that he could come out of this, um, you know, the same man he went into it, was to deeply focus and be very deeply disciplined on his mind and body during that period. And so, I mean, some of the times where he just, you know, calming his mind down and actually playing symphonies in his head, going through the periodic tables. It was just how can I use my brain so that I have a brain so that I can not go insane in this place. And then there was the physical component too, but it was
Yeah.
conscious decision to like to do to take to control what he could. I think it goes back to that same element. So much was out of his control, but these couple things were.
But he couldn't have done those things effectively unless he'd prepared himself before they threw him into lockdown. In other words, if he'd never studied all the things that he'd studied, how could he review them in his mind and think about them? He
Right.
wouldn't have the knowledge base which would allow him to do that. And if he hadn't, actually spent time, learning martial arts and learning yoga and understanding meditation, he'd still be in that 6x9 cell, but he'd have no tools to work with.
Right.
So this is why it's critical to learn as much as you can about everything, because you may need it sometime, A, and B, it's actually enjoyable to know more and to be stronger as opposed to weaker and all the rest of it. So it's critical to think in those terms. And I wonder, uh, you know, I don't know what the average kid, whoever the average kid is today, does. I mean, I know when I was a kid, uh, we used to, first of all, you'd get up and you'd go out and you'd run around all day. You'd actually run around and ride your bike, and that's what you did all day long. And then you came home when the streetlights came on. That's basically the deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if kids do that anymore because it might be dangerous. I mean,
Even
they think
before.
COVID's going to get them on the, more recently. So they're definitely in their basements now, but I don't know if they even do those things anymore.
I mean, I think there are some neighborhoods. I know of a couple neighborhoods where there's a lot of intention on the parts of the parents, and I look at these neighborhoods from the outside and I go, wouldn't want to live in a house that close to my neighbors. And I wouldn't want to, personally, I like the space or whatever, but if you're for an environment for kids, there's lots of kids there, and they do still do a lot of those same things. And there's a couple of them that I'm aware of, but for the most part, I think people are more worried about the safety of their kids, and I do know, and so they unreasonably, like unjustifiably, it's I can't say it for the last year about the safety of the public streets, maybe, but before that, it's the safest it ever been. The safest it ever been in America, and people were worried about it. And I say this as a parent, where I felt that worry unreasonably myself too. But I think that um, the devices, the electronics, these things that force us to consume, which I mean, obviously people are consuming, watching these videos with us. So we want the consumption to happen, but you got to be you got to regulate that consumption to make sure that it's doing things that are helping you, build that sound mind and sound body in some way.
Yeah, it really does take discipline to do that too. I mean, you might want to do it, but you know, you're not going to have the martial arts ability of Jet Li or Jason Statham unless you actually go out and practice it. Hard work, lots of times per week and
Yep.
for years.
Yep.
So, it's not just wishing and hoping. You actually have to go through the motions, and you're not going to gain the knowledge unless you not only read the book, but sometimes study the book and then commit to memory some of the points in the book so that you actually know them and can think about them and can draw relations with other things.
Mhm.
So it's actually hard work. And you and I are playing around right now with writing a book called The Renaissance Man. And what's a Renaissance man? It's somebody on the order of Leonardo, or if he, or Benjamin Franklin, for that matter. And there are quite a few of them around there that were took this idea of a sound mind and a sound body and took it to the max.
Mhm.
And you know,
What do you think it is that
well,
drives them? What makes them unique? What is it that drives them to do that? That you think, the average, most people are just, they don't. I mean, there must be something different about them.
that's a good question. I mean, apparently, some people really are just born smarter than others, and other people are born stronger and more agile, one thing and another than others. So, you're dealt a hand at birth, and you just got to play that hand as best you can. So, how do you do that? It's by doing everything you can and trying to be everything that you can. And that, you just got to play the cards that you're dealt
Yeah,
to
but
the
there's a
best degree of your ability. Most people don't. I mean, they just don't. They you know take this petty pace from day to day, and then before you know it, you're old, and getting old takes you by surprise. And then what happens? Well, I guess you die. Well, maybe at that point, it doesn't make any difference.
Mm,
Maybe it doesn't make any difference how you lived your life.
mm.
But
I don't know. Well, I don't know. I definitely would like to think that's not true. That it does make a difference how you lead your life, and I think that if nothing else, for your own enjoyment, like I think pushing to see what's possible is much more fun, even though it involves stress on your body and stress on your mind, and but pushing to see what's possible is it's much more fun. I don't. Yeah, much more fun.
and there is such a thing as feeling a sense of accomplishment.
There is.
So, but I don't think people crystallize and formulate that very much. I mean, it's just something that happens from time to time, and then they go on to the next thing and don't think about it. And you actually have to pursue these things, not just let these things happen to you. So,
So a couple of observations I've had just when I think you mentioned Franklin, who I've read more about than any of the other founding fathers, I think. And one of the interesting things is that he was very curious, very curious. And it seemed like his curiosity and the playfulness of that curiosity is fundamentally uh, it pushes the boundaries and it feels playful. You're doing something because it's play. And even though it's work, the curiosity makes a playful element to it. And I remember, and he was always experimenting with stuff just to see, from his like principles he'd follow and try one each day and report on how he did. It was just a constant experiment. His life was, from his air baths he would do, in the cold weather, because it made him feel more alive. And now I mean, if you think about that, we have these cryogenic uh, tanks basically that you go in if you're overly inflamed, like professional athletes go in them and it gets they're like negative 270 degrees Celsius or something. They get super
Yeah,
cold.
yeah, it's liquid nitrogen that's boiling off. Uh, I tried it once. Have you?
Yeah, I did. I liked it. I felt awake. Let's put it that way. I felt
Yeah. No, I liked it too. I would have liked it to have lasted at least a little bit longer, frankly. Uh, Wim Hof. You familiar with Wim Hof?
I am. Yep.
Yeah. Well, just the other day, when we talked the other day, I'm glad we did because, frankly, shoemaker's children, I was backsliding, and I've got a nice pool here in Uruguay, and it's summer, but the pool is still chilly, I've got to say. And I hadn't used the pool for about 5 days, and it was starting to bug me that, here I've got this great pool. It's simple, easy, kind of fun exercise, swimming. And it took that conversation with you to say, wait a minute, you're really being stupid. So I went to the pool and overcame my desire not to be shocked by the cold, jumped in, swam a half hour, was very happy. But I guess a lot of life is like that. You can always find an excuse not to do something that you know you should.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And I think, and that's why the sound mind really matters, right? Because it leads to the sound body. A sound mind says, what you're feeling right now is you want to avoid discomfort. I get it, but like it doesn't matter. Just get up and go, and it'll all be fine. Like your mind can kind of recognize this behavior pattern and point and prod and and help you drive the right activities.
Yeah, and of course, thinking that I was hesitating about jumping into a pool, which I don't know how I don't know what that pool is. 65 degrees. I'm just guessing. I have no idea unless I put a thermometer into it. And then you got Wim Hof, who sits in ice baths for an hour at a time and goes swimming in Arctic waters and walked up to, I guess, the first base camp of Everest just with a pair of sneakers and shorts. I mean, this is Superman kind of stuff, but listen, I'm sure he's genetically better for doing that type of thing, but you don't do that without discipline. Of course, he believes that it's going to help him to live longer, and he's probably right because things last longer if they're refrigerated, essentially. But you can't overcome the second law of thermodynamics. No matter how much you exercise, your body does eventually start falling apart. It's just a fact. It's
So
the
I'd like
second law of thermodynamics. Everything winds down.
I'm curious about two things. Well, a lot of things, but two things in particular. One is how do you recognize, when you're doing a good job building and strengthening a sound mind, and when you might be a little off the rails? Are there like indicators for that? That's question. That's the first part, and then the second thing is you talk about the second law of thermodynamics and the fact that physically our bodies definitely do break down. And and I don't know how much you want to get into it, but there are medical things. There are things that one can do to try and, you know, extend that at least. And I know you have some experience with some of those, and I don't know if you think any of those are helpful, you could talk
Yeah,
about it.
sure. I mean, Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw are two very old friends of mine, and they wrote a book called Life Extension, A Practical Scientific Approach. Big, thick book, 600 pages, 700 pages, something like that, fat, back in 1980. And it became a #1 bestseller. At about the same time, that my book, Crisis Investing, was a #1 bestseller back in 1980, a long time ago. And in that, they explored everything that was known, because they're research scientists and they take this seriously, everything that was known about extending your life. And of course, there have been huge advances that have been made since then. And they still keep up with that stuff. But I don't know if you can turn the hourglass over or not. I often like to joke that when it becomes possible, I want to trade my body in for Bruce Jenner's just before he won the decathlon. That'd be okay. And that may be technically possible. I'd love to do that, to have a perfect body that would allow you to keep developing your mind. And maybe you'd find out whether you have a spirit or not. I
Mm.
mean, a lot of people say that you do, or actually, it's probably technically incorrect to say that you have a spirit, because that would imply that your body has a spirit. That doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense that maybe you are a spirit and you have a body. I mean, what are you? Are you a piece of meat, or are you something more ethereal? But it's an advantage of reading stuff that you can actually amuse yourself speculating about it, which
No doubt.
you can't unless you've stood on the shoulders of other people that have more knowledge and have written about this stuff. So
Mhm.
I guess my bottom line to everybody is to, you know, go out and try to get in the best shape you can. It gets tougher as you get older, I absolutely promise you. And, keep learning things. Read that section in Assassin about how Charles conducts himself when he's in the federal can. I think that might be a good template to use as
Mhm.
to how to do it.
I agree. And right now, people have, because you're not in solitary confinement exactly, you do have access to information and resources. And the internet it is amazing, all the things that you can get. I mean, I remember a few weeks ago, you were telling us you were taking a class on thermodynamics, and, that you could do that from Uruguay is amazing, with a great teacher, probably, I'm guessing on the teaching
Yeah,
company, one of those courses. Yeah. And it's,
yeah,
so you can, so that's not, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, incidentally, this is another argument for not wasting a lot of time and money going to college and just hanging out with other young yahoos. It's that when I want to learn a subject, I find that if I take a course the first time, it familiarizes me with things, and time for these things to really crystallize and gel. At least that's the way I learn. I mean, the big benefit comes from doing it the second time. And
Mm.
if you just go to a college class, well, the lecture's gone. It's in the air. Then what do? Your notes are probably crappy, if you even read them or can read them. Bad penmanship. I don't know how people take notes these days. They type them out. But you miss a lot of stuff. And maybe you got drunk the night before, or maybe you're sleeping during class. College is such a misallocation of time. It's just shocking. You can learn absolutely everything you want just by going on the internet right now. That book, Zen and the Art of Murder, a long time ago. In that, we have a technical problem.
Okay, Doug, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of this is spelled out in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which was written a long time ago by a guy named Robert Pirsig. But one of the points that he makes there is that somebody who is just an ignorant, greasy motorcycle mechanic, that you wouldn't think anything. If he's going to be a good motorcycle mechanic, when he's torquing the head down with the wrench, well, you got to understand a little bit about metallurgy and, how, steel cuts into brass, and how a gasket is compressed, all this type of thing. And the more you learn about it, the better a motorcycle mechanic you are. But the trouble, then you learn a little bit about metallurgy. And as you pursue learning about that, you learn something about chemistry. And you pursue that and you learn something about physics. And you pursue that and you learn something about astronomy. And you pursue that and you learn something about philosophy. And then you learn something about English literature. And that leads you to history and so forth. So that is how uh, the greasiest, most originally ignorant motorcycle mechanic can turn himself into a Renaissance man, or at least a polymath. And it's an excellent and well-made point.
Yeah, and often it's easier
But
to learn things through trying to actually do things in the real world rather than just from an academic perspective, like just reading books only, for instance. Like and I think it's one problem with our educational system is that you're lectured at, and then you're reading the knowledge that is handed down to you, but there's a lot less sort of experiential knowledge, where you're actually going out trying to figure out, well, how could you from whether it's fixing a motorcycle or building a deck or figuring out how to how to get a truck out of a ditch. Even like there's a lot more, the real world, you can learn lots of different things if you have the ability to apply it. Even learning martial arts, or learning how to paint. Like you learn, I mean, any real physical act you learn, it goes way beyond that act itself as a learning mechanism.
yeah, that's absolutely correct. And this is, one thing that instead of going to college, I think a person should take that. You can do lots of things with those 4 years in order to develop a sound mind and a sound body. But one of them is to work at as many different jobs as you can, for a lot of reasons. You actually learn a lot hands-on, and you meet a lot of new people, get a lot of experience that you just won't get reading about it or watching guys work at it. So, and there's a certain time of life that you're better off doing that than other things. I mean, I, I remember one summer I was working all kinds of odd jobs in an industrial area in northern Indiana. I worked in a scrapyard for a month. I worked in a foundry for a month. The least value of them was working in a chemical cracking plant, which was really a brain dead and stupid thing. But at least while I was waiting for the barrel to fill up with cracking catalyst, I'd read mine on the barrel, move it off, put a new barrel in there, and go back to reading something, waiting for the buzzer to go off again. Well, that wasn't worth doing for a month, but it would have been worth doing for a couple of days just to hang around the air products plant. So you got to do a lot of these things.
So what do you do? People are isolated to some degree, should spend some energy focusing on sound mind, sound body. Are there any specific things that you would recommend for people to be focused on? Are there any, is there any skill of the moment, or I don't know, is there anything specific that you would recommend for people today, given what's happening in the world, that they really should invest in educating themselves around or building skills around?
Hmm. Anything in particular? That's a good question. Um, well, it's so easy to it's so easy to be caught up in this woke and social justice warrior and politically correct movement, as we were talking about yesterday. So I think it's important to read a bunch of different philosophers. That when you hear something that's woke, it won't just be kind of an inchoate, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that, but I can't put my finger on it.
Mm-hmm.
It would help you to put your finger on it and to, I don't like to get in arguments with people, but nonetheless, sometimes you have to say something. You just have to contradict them when
Yep.
they say something else. But if you don't have the tools to do that, all you'll be able to say is, well, that's not right. We'll have to agree to disagree. That's not good enough. You
No.
got to tell them exactly why you disagree. And you can't do that unless you have the tools. So I'd say that now in this environment, uh, like I said, reading, I would say the two books, I think we mentioned these before, or maybe not, are Ayn Rand's Virtuous Selfishness and Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. Those are those are two really simple books that say it as 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 quickly and strongly as any can. So that's a good place to start right there.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Like, even if you're not, it's not about debating with someone else. It's also about making sure that you aren't, your mind is not being, broken into essentially by these, because if you don't have a good defense mechanism, because you don't have clear thinking on your own, then, it's possible you could be persuaded or, on some of these items, you know what I mean? Like, if you don't have any sense of what, it's not right, but you don't have a good answer for why it might not be, then I think you're more likely to fall victim to these ideas yourself and poison your own thinking.
Exactly. And another area where this is true is science. Uh, Today, it's very fashionable for all kinds of people in this COVID hysteria to say, well, you got to follow the science. Well, it looks like there's about 100 types of conflicting science that none of them know anything about science as far as I can tell, but they like to say, well, you got to follow the science. So if you're going to have a discussion with one of these people, it's nice to know enough science to ask them a few questions on science to find out how much they know about science. But if you don't know anything about science, you don't know how much is the bullshit factor on their part.
Right.
And when these people say out of history, which is probably the history that they remember from a poorly written school book many years ago, or maybe that was repeated on some talk show. I mean, it really helps if you actually know something about history and you can ask them a few questions about history and see how much they actually know about it. I
Yep.
mean, there's all kinds of reasons to have lots of knowledge. And same thing goes with your body within constraints. I mean, you know, uh, everybody suffers from physical disabilities that you got to work around. I mean, not everybody's big example. It used to be a great example, but since Bruce went off the deep end, I guess it's not as good as an example
Not so much
as,
as that, no.
as it was 50 years ago. But nonetheless,
Yeah, I think one of the things on the science. So the hard thing with science is that it's so massive. I mean, honestly, the all the knowledge that we have accumulated over, since the Enlightenment is amazing. And so there's so much. And as for someone like me who didn't come in with a strong discipline and any of that exposure to much of it at all, the way that I've started, especially within this COVID hysteria, started to do things is I would just, when people would bring up. The different research papers that had been done. And I'm like, well, I'd never read actually any academic papers or anything submitted to Nature before. I had never read them. And so but I started reading them. I started reading them. And then when I didn't understand something, I would just look it up and try to understand what they mean by it. And, so by having a specific example because I really wanted to understand if what these people are telling me is true, I would go and look at the papers myself. And then things I didn't know, I'd look them up and it was all available. And then you find that once you do that, what I found that most of the people that are touting science literally have not read any of these papers. I mean, they haven't read them at all, and so they're just reading the headlines from NBC. I mean, that's what we're hearing from people. And there was my girlfriend pointed this out to me, but you mentioned it last week also, Doug, when we were talking about this 10 million person study in Wuhan that was as robust as a study could be that found zero evidence, not a single case of asymptomatic spread, not a single case. And this is a relatively newly published information. And it's just not part of the public conversation at all, because it basically makes everyone look stupid for all the crazy stuff we've done and locking people down, assuming that people who don't look sick aren't sick, which of course they aren't. And we know this as definitively as one could know, I guess, based upon the current science from this
Yeah.
study. But no one reads it. And if you did, the confidence you have in recognizing the insanity is very high. So I just encourage people just to you know, take some time, use it as an opportunity to learn. And also, it helps you understand all the straw man arguments that are placed up around you constantly, that they're not even real, but you don't have, because you don't know, you haven't invested in your own knowledge, you're not aware that they're a problem. So
Yeah. Gut feeling is not good enough. And, you know, relative to what's going on with the COVID hysteria, I forget who it was that said, was rather famous, that people go mad very quickly in a crowd, but they only recover their senses slowly and one by one.
mm,
It's not the exact, but it's close. But I forget who it was that said that. So, but he's so correct.
it's so correct. Yeah. And then on the let's see, so on the science part, that's the way I found, I think, is really useful to start to do something. And then, when we talk about the physical part, obviously being strong makes you feel ready to take on the world, and so like spending some time devoting yourself to increasing your physical strength and stamina, it's just something you have to do. And I have not done a great job of that lately myself, but this is a great reminder for me that I got to spend more time in the gym and doing sprints and things like that to challenge myself.
Yep.
So
Yeah, exactly. So I guess if nothing else, I guess this last few minutes has served as a reminder to people that mens sana and corpore sano.
yes, and it's also a reminder to us that we should not maybe stop playing around with this Renaissance man book and start doing something more serious with it.
I know, I know. I've got to sit down and actually think about it, where to go and how to do it, because there's a market for a book like that. It's needed at a want, which Jordan Peterson proved to some degree,
Mhm.
and I for all kinds of reasons. So I guess back to the salt mines.
Back to the salt mines. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that today, Doug. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we'll chat with you tomorrow.
Thanks.